one of the pleasures we have as program chair here is picking the keynote speaker. And I'm very happy to introduce Joe Henrich, who is here from Harvard University. Dr. Henrich is currently the Ruth Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. Before moving to Harvard, he was a professor of both economics and psychology at UBC for nearly a decade, where he had held the Canada Research Chair in Culture, Cognition, and Co-Evolution. His research basically uses evolutionary theory to understand how human psychology gives rise to cultural evolution and how this has shaped our species' genetic evolution. And using insights generated from this approach, he has explored a variety of topics, including economic decision-making, social norms, fairness, religion, marriage, prestige, cooperation, and innovation. He's conducted long-term anthropological fieldwork in Peru, Chile, and the South Pacific, as well as having spearheaded several large comparative projects. In 2004, he won the Presidential Early Career Award for Young Scientists, and in 2009, the Earlier Career Award for Distinguished Contributions bestowed by the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. In 2013-2014, he held the Peter and Charlotte Schoenfeld Faculty Fellowship at NYU Stern School of Business. In 2018, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology awarded him the Wegner Prize for Theoretical Innovation. From 2010 to 2019, he has been a senior fellow in the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in the Institutions, Organizations, and Growth Group, and he became a fellow of the Cognitive Science Society in 2021. In 2016, he published The Secret of Our Success, published by Princeton University Press, and in 2020, a book which he'll probably be talking about today, The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. I read that book and I was fascinated. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Joe Henrich.
Well, it's great to be with you all, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to Raghu for that nice introduction. Today what I want to do is give you kind of about 40 minutes drawing on the weirdest people in the world, and also some more recent research coming out of my lab. And I thought to get us started, we would jump right in and really take a global perspective on things. So this is a map of the nighttime illumination of the globe. And this has allowed economists and others to get a measure of economic prosperity that allows you to get sort of much more detailed view of the world. And we're going to use this to test some ideas about what leads to economic prosperity around the globe. So we'll use nighttime luminosity as a measure of economic prosperity. Now, a number of scholars have tried to use this, and so there's already existing good evidence that it's a useful proxy. But we did our own tests, and we put together the largest compilation of local subnational data on economic production, and we get a correlation of about 0.86. So the nighttime luminosity seems to capture what the standard economic measures, although it allows us to cover much more of the globe. And what I want to suggest or try to convince you of is that there is a relationship between something that we don't normally think about when we're thinking about economic growth and what causes it, how families are organized. So human societies, based on the anthropological record, have had very different family organizations. Many societies were organized in clans, patrilineal and matrilineal, kindreds, using extensive kin networks. They've had different marriage systems. You'll hear more about those in a little while, and different kinds of inheritance norms. And I'm going to put together these ideas in an anthropological concept called kinship intensity. And that's going to allow us to explain some of the variation we see around the globe. Now, the argument here is that the ability to generate economic growth involves an articulation of aspects of culture with formal institutions that evolved and spread out of Europe after 1500. So we're thinking about that. So if you're more interested in the details of this, I'm going to give you a quick overview but my colleagues and I, who are listed up there, have a working paper that's available. Now, to say a little bit more about kinship intensity, now we're taking an idea from anthropology. And the anthropological idea is that societies vary in how tightly the norms of kinship are, how tightly they weave together people's social networks. So many of you probably grew up in what, to an anthropologist, is a very weak kinship system. So small monogamous nuclear families. You probably don't rely on your cousins. You're not going to have to employ your brother-in-law. You're just not involved in a very dense family network. And this is very distinct from most human societies over most of human history. So to measure this, we took a trick from the anthropologists and went back to something called the ethnographic atlas. So in the 1960s, anthropologists put together a database with data from anthropological societies from around the world. And using that data, we're able to create a map of the globe in terms of the kinship intensity of different traditional societies around the globe. So the average age on these observations is around 1900 CE. So we're going back, the economic data is from 2010. So that's the satellite luminosity. We could use other data. It doesn't matter if we use 2015 satellite data or 1995. So we have a kinship intensity measure there. Now, you might worry, and quite sensibly, that maybe the anthropological observations, the ethnographic atlas, is not really capturing what people are doing. These are just anthropologists writing ethnographies that are getting coded in and put into a database. So my colleague at Harvard, David Reich, is one of the leading experts on ancient DNA. And in his lab, they put together something called the Human Origins Data Set. And that has data from all around the world and back into history. So we took that data and we matched it to the ethnographic atlas. And then we can look at the runs of homozygosity in this genetic data. And we should expect that if you marry your cousins, for example, or you have a lot of endogamous marriage, it'll leave marks in the genome. Individuals will tend to have longer strips of runs of homozygosity in the genes that, you just get by marrying cousins or mating endogenously. So we can use this as a second way of measuring kinship intensity. Now here, we don't think that it's actually genes doing the work. It's just that the cultural practices leave marks in the genome that allow us to spot it. Okay, so just to give you a quick look, this is a partial regression plot, but basically more kinship intensity, less light luminosity. So the idea here is that places with small monogamous nuclear families are able to generate more economic growth, at least as measured by nighttime luminosity. And then places with clans and polygyny and kindreds and whatnot have less. Now, this table is probably very intimidating, and for some of you, if you're an economist, you're used to looking at tables like that. It probably makes you feel warm and cheery inside. So you don't need to look at this. I'm going to explain everything you need to know. So we're trying to look for the relationship between this nighttime luminosity measure and kinship intensity. And what you see here is a negative relationship, and we can do this just by comparing groups within countries. So none of this, or at least some of these specifications, some of the models here, we hold the country constant. We just compare ethnic groups within countries, and we can see the effect. You'll also notice that we're holding constant log population density. So that means that this is the extra luminosity you get over and above what you'd expect by knowing the population density. So we're not picking up population density. It's there, and you'll notice that the population density coefficient is close to 1, which means we can interpret the effect here of kinship intensity as a per capita measure. So this is the effect of kinship intensity on economic productivity per capita. It's just convenient that it turned out to be close to 1 in terms of expressing things. So just looking at this one model, a standard deviation increase in kinship intensity is associated with a 40% decrease in luminosity. So you get more intense family structures and you get less luminosity, so less economic prosperity. So it looks like there's at least a relationship here, possibly between these two variables. Now we can switch out our kinship intensity and put in our inbreeding coefficient, and you get very similar relationships. So it's nothing about the anthropological data per se. We can use a genetic proxy and get the same thing. And we can also drop out the log luminosity and use the available data that economists have pulled together, and we get the same relationship. So there's nothing specific to our log luminosity measure. Now, we did another trick that's common, at least in the economics literature. So it's called a regression discontinuity, but it sounds complicated, conceptually simple. We looked just within countries, and we have these different ethno-linguistic groups, and we look at the border between them. And if the theory is right, when we cross from a low kinship intensity group to a high kinship intensity group, it should get darker. And that's indeed what we find, that you just go to the border and it gets darker. And we can move that border around to see if it's maybe something not consistent with our hypothesis, but this holds up pretty well, and we can put it through its paces. So this suggests that there really is a relationship here. But the next question is, why in the world would you expect there to be a relationship between kinship intensity and economic growth? Typically, economists and others suggest that it's these kinds of factors: innovation, specialization, political institutions. So, for example, Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson have suggested that it's pluralistic political institutions. Trade, of course, international trade seems to be important. And I agree with that, and I think those are all important. But how do you get to pluralistic political institutions? How do you generate the kind of innovation which led to the Industrial Revolution? How do you get democratic representative government type institutions? And I'm going to argue, and the book argues, that it's related to the nature of kinship norms and the way they shape societies. So two crucial pathways that I think are co-evolving here are cultural psychology. So I'm going to give you evidence that suggests that people in different places, for lots of reasons, but including kinship norms, think differently about the world. It's not just that our psychologists have often thought of our minds as digital computers. So the idea there is that there's hardware and software, and psychologists like to think they're studying the hardware, and then the rest is for the anthropologists and sociologists is what you pour in there. But that's not the emerging consensus. It's that our brains adapt ontogenetically, our wiring changes in our brains to the world we confront. So if you change the institutions, and probably the oldest and most important institution is kinship, you change the wiring. People adapt as they grow up over developmental time. So that's going to be important. Ecological variables are going to affect kinship intensity, so that's one of the things my lab's focused on. But I'm going to take the more interesting and perhaps more controversial one, that religions have shaped kinship intensity. And in particular, the spread of one branch of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church across Europe, modified the intensive kinship systems of the Celts and the Franks and the Germanic and other Germanic populations, and broke them down into monogamous nuclear families. Now, to really think about kinship, we need a way of thinking about culture, because kinship norms are products of cultural evolution, so is religion, so we need to think about that. So I'm going to do the secret of our success in one slide. So this is my 2016 book. And this is how we think about cultural evolution in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. So we begin with the idea that humans are apes. There's lots of things you get to know about humans once you know we're apes. We're social. We care about status. We interact with others. We make relationships. But we're a special kind of ape that's undergone a selective process that has led for powerful capacities for learning others. So this is what gives rise to culture. Because when infants come into the world compared to other primates, we rapidly learn from other members of our social group. We acquire languages and eventually norms and techniques and skills from other members of our social group. So the developmental psychologist Mike Tomasello describes this as imitation machines when he does comparisons with other primates. We also have other aspects of our psychology which are going to play important, so you don't want to forget about those. And this is a whole field that's called cultural evolution, and you can use the logic of natural selection to model the kinds of psychologies you expect. But then once you know something about those psychologies, you can say, well, how do they give rise to technology, to rituals, to different kinds of religious beliefs, to norms and institutions, and of course the diversity of 7,000 languages that we see in the world. And the key point here that I want to make is that our minds have evolved in a world with culture for so long, I've argued it's over 1 million years, that our brains are ready to adapt its information processing to the world we face. So we already know, for example, that our visual system adapts to the visual worlds we confront. One example that some of you may have encountered is an illusion called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. It's the one where you have two parallel lines with in arrows and out arrows. And people from around here, actually the original research was done in Chicago. You need to make the line with the in arrows a fifth longer than the other line before people see them as the same length. That's why it's an illusion. But if you do this among hunter-gatherers, they don't see the illusion. They actually perceive the lines as they are. And there's the full range of variability. So our visual processing is effective. We also know there's a growing body of evidence that the rituals, the daily devotions that people have to go to, so morning prayer, for example, in Islam, creates a kind of self-regulation capacity that then allows people to do well in other domains. So ritual devotions matter. And I could go down the line. Languages affect our cognition in interesting ways. But I want to focus on social norms, and particularly one set of social norms related to kinship. The other arrow that goes back to natural selection is in The Secret of Our Success. I make the case that a lot of this cultural products actually went back and shaped our genetic evolution over hundreds of thousands of years. But for today, we're just going to focus on the cultural evolution. Okay, now if you want to think about kinship norms in kin-based institutions, so from this perspective, institutions are just collections of social norms. Kin-based institutions are the oldest and probably the most fundamental of human institutions in the sense that they're probably the very first institutions that emerged were kinship-based, and it's the first institution that kids encounter when they enter the world. You've got to adapt to the world of your family before you go out and figure out any of the other institutions. And there's some basic features of human psychology that we share with other primates that are important for understanding this. So one is our kin psychology. So we're inclined to help genetic relatives. And there's a large body of research showing that the further away genetically someone gets, the less likely you are to give them a kidney, for example. 85% of kidney donors are primary relatives. But then important on the kin psychology is the kin-based networks. So once you have that, you can use that to shape the social network. So in lots of societies, those with intensive kinship, you call certain cousins brother and sister, and then that pulls them in and gives them certain responsibilities and whatnot, similar to what a brother and sister would have. There's also rules about incest, which I'll get to. The second one is pair bonding. So we share that with gorillas. So gorillas also form pair bonds. Male gorillas actually engage in more parental care than we see in lots of other primates. And then build around that, we have marriage systems. So marriage are sets of social norms which regulate pair bonds, can regulate where you live after marriage, or the responsibilities of the couple, or how many spouses you can have simultaneously. In gorillas, there's one male with multiple females. That's very common in humans, but also other patterns are common too. Okay, incest aversion. So humans have an evolved mechanism for avoiding sex with close relatives. So that's the disgust reaction you experience with the idea of having sex with one of your siblings. But human societies have extended that in the form of incest taboos. So we have lots of taboos on cousins across societies, where you can't have sex with various cousins or uncles or step relatives even. So that's something where culture has grabbed a hold of a basic instinct and extended it in various ways. It's worth knowing that in some societies, your first cousins or at least one set of them are preferred marriage partners. So societies really mess around with this. Okay, so this structures human social networks at a fundamental level. All right, now all of this talk of kinship may sound weird to you guys, and that's because most of you are used to these small monogamous nuclear families, which are strange in human history and across societies. So just to give you a sense of this, I made this list from the Ethnographic Atlas, that this body of data from over 1,200 societies that anthropologists have put together. So most of you are probably familiar with bilateral descent. So that's where we track descent roughly equally through mom and dad. Most societies don't have that. So only 28% of human societies have bilateral descent. Cousin marriage, you might think it's rare, but 75% of societies have cousin marriage. It's permitted or even preferred. Monogamous marriage. Only 15% of human societies have monogamous marriage. So most societies over human history have allowed high status and elite males to take additional wives. Polyandry is vanishingly small. 0.1, 0.2% of societies have polyandrous marriage, where the wife takes multiple husbands, and that's always, they also have polygyny in those societies. And then nuclear families, also very rare, so 95% or 2% don't have. And then neolocal residence, which is where the newly married couple lives independent of either the bride or the groom's family. So that's also very rare. And if we add these up, you can see that over 50% of societies, let's see here. If you look at the zero, where there's this graph shows the count of the number of weird practices you have and the percentage. So that first high bar shows that most societies have 0 of the kind of weird kinship practices that many of us are accustomed to. It's actually 50.1%. And very few societies have all 5. If you dig into those, they are either European descent societies or societies where missionaries got there before the anthropologists. So my favorite one is in the Philippines. The communities of Cebu in the Philippines are there. And Magellan actually washes up there. And he actually gets killed in the Philippines. But they record intensive kinship. But then 60 years later, the Dominican missionaries get there and change the system, which is why it ended up there. Okay. Now, a common assumption is that the kinship systems, the small monogamous nuclear families that characterize so many European descent populations, that this was maybe a product of the Industrial Revolution or the rise in wealth. Maybe when people get more money, they want to have monogamous nuclear families. But actually, the change occurred well before that. And there's good documentation that it was before 1500, and it may stretch back even further in some parts of Europe. And it's actually embedded in our terminology, and people don't realize this. So you're familiar with what we call our affines. So what we call in-laws, anthropologists call affines. So when you refer to your sister-in-law, did you ever wonder what the in-law part is? Well, it's in canon law. And that's because you're supposed to think of your sister as someone you would not marry and cannot have sex with. And that might sound like a strange thing to worry about, but in lots of societies, your wife's sister would be a marriage partner. In polygynous societies, she could be a second wife. And even more commonly, if your wife died, she would be the replacement. Because you want to maintain the relationship between the families, and they can switch them out like that. So many of you have been to a wedding where at some point in the ceremony, so this would be a Protestant or a Catholic wedding, the priest or pastor says something like, if anyone can here show just cause while this couple should not be lawfully joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. And then there's a silence. Nothing happened. This is actually an incest inquiry, and it's introduced into Catholic weddings around 800 CE in the Carolingian Empire. And it's meant to be a final, we got everyone together who knows these people, and we do one final check to make sure they're not cousins or somehow related. Because they kept moving out the distance that you would not want to marry in terms of cousins. Okay. Now, so the Catholic Church has this expansive set of incest taboos, which prevents marriage to affines. It also prevents marriage to spiritual kin, and this expanding first cousins, second cousins, third cousins goes all the way out to 6 cousins by the year 1000, and then they pull it back in the Fourth Lateran Council. The Church also bans polygamy, so the tribe populations of Europe were polygamous. Bans sex slaves, the Romans loved sex slaves. No arranged marriages, and the bride actually got to say at the wedding ceremony whether she did or didn't. So when she says, I do, that's very rare cross-culturally, but it was a check to make sure it wasn't a forced or arranged marriage. The Church is also big on inheritance, so they want to strap inheritance to the lineal line, and they want inheritance by testament. So all this reshapes the kinship systems of Europe. It takes centuries, though. Okay, so this is the basic diagram you saw before. And I want to give you a little bit of evidence on cultural psychology, because you're probably not familiar with that. And then I'm going to try to provide evidence for these other 2 arrows here, the relationships here. All right. And I want to say that I'm emphasizing the role of kinship because I think it plays an important role. But in the book, I talk about other things that affect our cultural psychology, the way other institutions shape them, including in personal markets. Okay, so you may not be aware, but there's a growing body of evidence that there's lots of psychological variation around the world. Usually, if people are familiar with this at all, they know about individualism. So psychologists, and before them anthropologists, had been trying to measure and assess individualism in different populations around the world. So this is a measure from social psychology that shows you the variation. So the countries that are the most individualistic in the world are the US, Australia, and the UK. So you can see they're the darkest there. I'll emphasize the gray area as well because, this is very much an enterprise that's in progress. There's a lot of terra incognito in terms of many dimensions of psychology, so we don't know what's going on in the gray areas. Now, also important here, though, is this is only really a picture that's beginning to emerge and coalesce. most psychologists, including behavioral economics, have sampled from one narrow, unusual population. And I'll say more about that in a second. I can talk about the variation either in terms that would be understood by economists, so we know there's ample variation in beliefs and preferences. So Armin Falk and his colleagues, Ben Anke, Anke Becker, and others, have a paper where they try to measure altruism, fairness, trust, risk, gender equality is in there, reciprocity, and they show tremendous variation around the world. They have 80 countries and 80,000 subjects, so massive variation in economic preferences. One funny thing about economics is that they like to say that preferences are exogenous, but it seems to me preferences could be the most important thing to be explained if you want to explain behavior. But I could also phrase this in terms of cognitive science. So there's variation in attention, memory, perception, reasoning styles, and decision biases. So many of you are probably familiar with things from behavioral economics, like the endowment effect. Well, hunter-gatherers don't have the endowment effect. It's highly variable. The U.S. is the highest. So a lot of the things that we take to be features of human behavior, such as these decision heuristics, it's all highly Western biased and not representative of the globe. And I can talk about conformity, norm tightness, and patience as well. Okay. So this is a tip of the psychological iceberg. I wanted to give you a taste for it. So in 2010, my colleagues and I at the University of British Columbia wanted to raise concerns about the biases in the psychological literature. And so we coined this acronym WEIRD as a consciousness-raising device. So this stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And the point, people sometimes try to read too much into the acronym. It's only meant to kind of remind researchers that so much of what we know comes from this narrow slice of humanity. For a long time, it was mostly American college students. So the number we have back in 2008 is that 96% of students in psychological experiments were weird. That was also true for behavioral economics. Today, things have improved a lot. Now the number is 95%. So we haven't, they've moved to MTurk, so they're not students so much, but that hasn't changed that much. There is this pattern of variation. So the populations that are most studied, weird populations, tend to be highly individualistic, highly analytical. They have a non-relational or universalistic morality. So the moral psychologists have been into this. They tend to interpret behavior according to dispositions. So people are trustworthy, as if they're trustworthy across all domains. Other societies don't do that. Trust in strangers varies, and intention-based morality. There's a lot of emphasis on mental states. And like I said, it includes all these different domains. Just one caution, though. There's a tendency to set up a weird versus non-weird dichotomy in your mind. As soon as we created the acronym, I guess you'd create the antithesis. And so people will refer to non-weird societies. This is a bad idea. And the reason is because it's kind of like if we had been studying penguins and we said, well, there's this bird that swims and it has solid bones unlike other birds. We're going to call it a penguin. And then you create the category non-penguin, which is not very informative, right? If knowing something is not a penguin doesn't tell you very much about it. All right. The other thing, cautionary note I want to put out here, I'm going to show you lots of stuff on psychological variation, is that there's a kind of ethnocentric tendency to maybe be a little bit judgy about this psychological variation. So some societies that are conformist, people have said, well, Joe, you're dissing those societies, calling them conformists. But actually, when you go there and you ask people, they're like, it's good to be a conformist. We teach our children to be conformists. And in fact, Christine Laguerre did very detailed psychological work between Vanuatu and Texas. And parents describe kids who are more conformist as smarter. And the Texas parents describe them, the ones who are deviants, as smarter. So there's just this, difference in values. Okay. So I want to give you a sense as to why these kinship institutions would affect our psychology so much. So I just want to create a comparison here. So we have intensive-based kinship institutions with these tight networks where most relationships are given at birth. And you really don't have much room for finding new relationships. Whereas in the world of nuclear families, you need to go out and find your friends, business partners, and mates out there. So you've got to cultivate your dispositions. What's going to do well for you in the marketplace? So you want to cultivate these dispositional attributes. Whereas in the other world, you're mostly focused on fulfilling your roles and obligations. You have lots of responsibilities and obligations to various relatives, and you do well by fulfilling those. When you want to find a new relationship in the world of intensive kinship, you use your existing connections, because what makes someone trustworthy is having a lot of connections to them. You want to rely on the networks. Whereas in the other world, you want to find somebody trustworthy or someone that has skills complementary that fit well with yours. Trust based on embeddedness. And so there's just different demands. So in one world, you're trying to live up to relational demands. In the other world, you're trying to set your own standards. So this is the shame versus guilt thing. I can say more about that if people are interested. Okay, so the empirical problem we set ourselves was to try to connect these dots. We need to show that we can link the church to kin-based institutions to psychology, and then if that's true, we should be able to do this. We're going to measure kin-based institutions in different ways. We can use the Kinship Intensity Index that I told you a little bit about, or we can use cousin marriage data just as another kind of proxy measure. Right. So just to show you a little bit of cross-national data. So this is the relationship between the number of centuries different populations were under the church and the rate of cousin marriage in the 20th century. The more centuries under the church, the lower the rate of cousin marriage across the world. We can also take now I'm using cousin marriage just because it's easy to understand, and I could use the Kinship Intensity Index and the plots look the same. So more cousin marriage, people tend to have a less individualistic and a less impersonal psychology. So trust in strangers, cooperation with strangers. And I could show you plots like this one that I just put up for 17 different cross-cultural psychological variables. And if you see similar patterns. And then finally, we can look at this one, which is more centuries under the Western Church, the more of an individualistic, impersonal psychology you get. Whenever we could, we looked at centuries under the Eastern Church, which had historically a kind of weak version of the program that the Western Church had with its incest taboos and its inheritance laws and different things about marriage. And so you get this weak effect for Eastern Church, for the Orthodox Church. Okay, now we really wanted to dig into this. So we created a database of the spread of bishoprics through Europe. So we have a GPS location and a bishopric. And if you add up all the dosages, and you can see that map of Europe there shows that there's different parts of Europe are getting different dosages of the church. That's the number of centuries that each part of contemporary Europe has been under the church. So in what's going to come, I'm only going to compare Europeans with other Europeans. On there, you can see I also put the Carolingian Empire because the Carolingian rulers teamed up with the Pope to impose a lot of this marriage and family program. And then I also put the Iron Curtain on there because you might think that that's important. Okay, so we went to the European Social Survey and we got survey measures that allow us to measure conformity and obedience, individualism and independence, impersonal fairness, and impersonal trust. And so that gives us 4 measures. People answered on a 0 to 10 scale. And then the question is we just test our hypotheses. And what we find is that individuals from regions with longer exposure to the church show greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism and independence. Now, we only compare regions within the same country. So none of this is about national health care, national wealth, or anything like that. We have 200,000 people from 442 different regions of Europe. We put in measures of income, demographics, education. This all holds, holding those constant. We also have measures of Roman roads, so we know where all the Roman roads went. So we don't think it's Roman influence. We have initial prosperity measures in 500 and things like medieval universities, monasteries, and the Carolingian Empire. One of the most persuasive analyses for me was when we said, well, let's throw out all of Western Europe and just focus on everything to the east, on the east side of the Iron Curtain. And there we get the same kind of patterns when we go over there. Okay, we did a bunch of additional analyses, so I could show you stuff linking the medieval church spread to 20th century cousin marriage. I could show you the relationships between cousin marriage in the 20th century and the psychological measures we've been talking about. So when you have more cousin marriage, you have more conformity and obedience. And if you look at that top plot, you'll see that we put Turkey on there. Now, the result holds if we drop Turkey off. But Turkey is right where you'd expect it. And it has a completely different history, right? But if you know its cousin marriage rate, you can say something about its psychology. And the same thing with individualism, independence. More cousin marriage, less individualism, independence. Turkey's right about where it should be. Okay. And then we also did this second-generation immigrant trick. So we pulled out only the second-generation immigrants. So their parents come from all over the world. They have kids. The kids take the survey. And then we attach the kids to where the parents came from. And we can show there's an echo of where the parents came from. When the parents came from a group with more intensive kinship, we get the same results we've been getting. So it holds up, and it really suggests the channel is cultural transmission. Okay, and then we also have an analysis of just Italy. Now, I could go, let's see here. Oh, I can't read my launch. Oh, perfect. So I tried to test this idea in other ways and get out of Europe and get away from the church. So one trick is to go to China and India. There's lots of variation within these countries in kinship intensity, but mostly it's not due to Christianity. It's due to the fact that ecology, as I mentioned, also affects kinship intensity. So paddy rice agriculture and the combination of paddy rice and monsoon shocks may actually affect the presence of clans. So if you just look at the distribution of clans in China, it's clear that something's going on with paddy rice. And then what the psychologist Thomas Talhelm has done is he's gotten measures of analytic thinking and self-concept, which is related to individualism, and in-group loyalty, so sort of nepotism type measures. And he shows that you have basically the same results. So more paddy rice, more intensive kinship, less analytic thinking, a more holistic self-concept or interdependent self-concept, and more in-group loyalty. So more loyalty to friends and family over the anonymous stranger. And he can replicate that in India. Now, the economist Augustin Bergeron went to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, here Christianity plays a role, but in a very different way than Europe. So Christian missions get located throughout the DRC. And what Augustin did is he measured people's psychology in the city of Kananga. But those people were all migrants from villages that's stretching quite far from Kananga. And then he looked at the location of those villages relative to the historical locations of Christian missions. And people who grew up at villages closer to Christian missions had more monogamous nuclear families and then the kinds of psychology you would expect. So when they had more monogamous nuclear families, they were more morally universalistic, using the standard tools from psychology, and had less in-group loyalty. So it replicates there. And most recently, in a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, some economists from the University of British Columbia looked at the state laws in the U.S. So Protestantism kind of takes off the rules that the church had on cousin marriage. Immigrants come from Europe into the U.S. and they begin spreading around. Cousin marriage starts popping up in some states. States decide to make laws against cousin marriage. So you can use the timing of the law and the surnames that were engaging in a lot of cousin marriage before it to show that the law reduces the rate of cousin marriage and then has long-term effects on income and urbanization. So people migrate more to cities. So that fits with the basic story. Okay. So now I want to just close up here by focusing a bit on innovation. Now to get to innovation, first I have to give you a theory about what drives innovation. And so this is an idea from cultural evolution that I kind of lay out in The Secret of Our Success, and then it appears in The Weirdest People in the World. And you find this idea in lots of places. Stephen Johnson has written about it in popular books. So the idea is that most inventions are actually recombinations in some way. It could be just putting together different technologies, or it could be taking an idea from another field and pulling it into your field and kind of fixing it up a bit. So they're recombinations. What's going to lead to that? Well, larger populations, you have more people engaging in this, so that's going to make it more likely. If you have people with different stuff in their head, greater cognitive diversity, different ways of thinking about the world, that's going to provide more ingredients for recombination. And then if the flow of ideas among minds is greater, you're going to have more chances for recombination. So you can imagine if you had very cognitively diverse people, none of whom ever talk to each other, then it doesn't matter that they have different stuff in their heads, right? So they've got to be interacting. And this is where things like psychology, like trust and individualism and whatnot, is going to play a big role. Okay, now in the Weirdest People in the World, I am trying to explain the Industrial Revolution, and I point to a bunch of different kinds of evidence that suggest that that's the case. So I'm going to actually skip over that because I want to make sure to get to this. So we're looking at patents in Europe from 1980 to 2014 across over 1,400 European regions. Now, what I can do is I can show you the psychology that I previously looked at that if a society has a weirder psychology, so more impersonal trust, fairness, individualism, and nonconformity, you get more patents. And it's a pretty big effect, so somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of a standard deviation increase in patents when you get this weirder psychology, just comparing Europeans and Europeans. Now, you can tell the same story for social networks. So the idea is that the psychology and the social networks are moving together. So regions of Europe which have more nuclear families have more patents per capita. And if you use Facebook friends, so regions with more Facebook friends that are further away, you get more patents. And that's this flow of ideas and more trust. So now I'll show these connections. I should be able to do this connection if that's true. And this probably surprises people, at least when I gave this talk in Europe, it did. So more centuries under the church, more patents per capita. We can control for all kinds of things. We only compare within the same country. So then people are like, well, there must be something else the church is doing. It can't be this kind of complicated story you tell. So what we did is we went to the synods that were occurring throughout Europe, and we got the attendance lists of the bishops who showed up at the different councils which were making these incest regulations. And we divided the councils into those that discussed incest legislation and those that didn't. And then we added up the bishop's attendance at each of these. So we get a measure of how much your bishop attended the meetings with incest, and we get another measure of how much they attended the other meetings. And it's different bishops moving through time. This is occurring over centuries. So what we're able to show is that when your bishop attended more of the anti-incest legislation, you get more patents per capita. But the other one doesn't matter at all. So it doesn't matter if you went to all the other church issues. All right. Okay. So that's the end of my main material. Just a couple of take-home messages. So I've tried to link aspects of psychology to things like prosperity, innovation, democracy, and corruption. So these are all things you need to think about with a view to psychological variation, which takes you into deep history. So we should think of these things as products of formal institutions, which is what most people have concentrated on, and culture, which is a product of these long-term changes. I've suggested that we need to think about humans as a cultural ape. So unfortunately, there's this distinction between those of us who study humans as another animal among many and what happens in the rest of the social sciences. And there's really a rich opportunity to connect those at this point. And finally, a field of cultural evolutionary psychology is what we need, where we can think about how culture changes over time. And then I'll just close with one of the things we've been doing in my lab is we're using natural language processing techniques to measure psychology from texts. So we have ways of extracting measures of individualism. For example, we've already done this in U.S. newspapers, going back as far as U.S. newspapers go back, which take us into the 18th century, for example. And I actually have a team of Latin scholars where we're trying to do this in Latin. And if we pull that trick off, then we'll be able to go back to 2,000, 3,000 years. All right. That's it.